前排影完踎低俾後排影埋好嘛？
Cameraman at the back.
Almost 差唔多啦，係嘛？前排不如影咗咁耐都
Almost it. So please allow those at the back to have a shot.
我諗差唔多啦
I think you're ready.
好，唔該晒。
Thank you. Friends of the media, thank you for coming to the press conference today. In a moment, the Chief Executive will say a few words and then she'll take questions from you. Please raise your hand and introduce yourself and identify your organization. The Chief Executive, please. Friends of the media, fellow citizens of Hong Kong, this morning at the Legislative Council, I spoke for a brief moment. And after that, I had to rely on a televised link to deliver the third policy address of my term of office. As to the title of my policy address, it is called Treasure Hong Kong, Our Home. I have to emphasize that we treasure Hong Kong. This is because in the past few months, we have got a lot of disputes and violence has been escalating. We are all very worried. We need to treasure Hong Kong. It is an appeal. It is also the common aspiration of the people of Hong Kong. Today, irrespective of your political stance, I hope that you will set aside your differences. We should find a way out for Hong Kong. And this has led me to the second part of the title of my policy address. In other words, our home. It means we have to join hands to build our home. Our home. It is something very concrete, and it will bring up an image that we would like to build our home. So for the policy address that I delivered this year, I focus on housing and land supply. Hong Kong is our home. It is a place that we love dearly. But it is more than just a number of housing blocks. Nor would it just be a sum of the policy initiatives covered by the policy address supplement. Our home means that we embrace a society which is civilized, law-abiding, equal, fair, with mutual respect, among other values that we treasure. I believe that it is the most important spirit of Hong Kong. For the past few months, there were a lot of serious social conflicts, and they have challenged and eroded our treasured core values. In the light of what has happened lately, I understand that as someone, as a politician, well, it is time for awakening, and I have to understand the sentiments of the people. I also understand that irrespective of the best intentions, I need to be open and inclusive and tolerant. While I emphasize administrative efficiency, I need to listen patiently. In the course of preparing for this policy address, let me share with you my observations. I've been a civil servant for decades, and there are a few points that are different from what I used to be familiar with. First of all, I have set aside the bureaucracy, and I've been very bold in working on issues and policies that are welcomed by the people but somehow the government has been impeded. Let me cite an example. First of all, we have boldly considered the use of the Land Resumption Ordinance so as to resume land for the sake of having public housing. Well, probably you'll recall our previous position. That is, without a detailed planning for a new town, or if it is not a specific government project, then we would be worried about legal action or legal challenges. And that's why we haven't invoked the imperial sort, so to speak, that is the Land Resumption Ordinance. Today, we think out of the box. We like to use the land for the people. After planning, we are going to invoke the Land Resumption Ordinance so as to resume the privately owned land so that the sites will be 100% for the sake of public housing. Another example is to give a new mission to the Urban Renewal Authority, URA, so that the URA may provide subsidized housing to eligible applicants within their sites. On my part, I used to be the Secretary for Development for 5 years, and the URA's work came under me. At that time, the government's thinking was that the URA should be self-financing, and the URA should adopt cautious commercial principles in its operation. So they compensated their property owners on the basis of the value of a 7-year-old property. And the URA was supposed to get revenue so as to fund the projects. So it isn't anything inherently wrong with the URA. Rather, it's a matter of the government's thinking and a matter of use of resources. Today, again, I have boldly asked the URA to take up more social responsibilities. That is, as a result and via the renewal projects, the housing thus produced should be subject to the following arrangement. Just like the pilot scheme we had this year in Matawai Road, there were 450 such units. In this way, we can make use of this channel to help those who are aspiring homeowners. Thirdly, for those on the public housing waiting list living in inadequate housing conditions, we should provide a regular cash subsidy, or what the people have called a rent allowance. In the past, our thinking was that in the absence of rent control, the provision of such a subsidy would only benefit the landlords without benefiting the tenants. Perhaps it is still true, and in fact it may be the result of studying the overseas experience. But still, we need to resolve the problem. There should be many solutions, more solutions than problems. So for those on the public housing waiting list, for those living in poor conditions, we haven't yet got the adequate number of housing units for them. I think it is just right for us to consider providing a cash subsidy. As I have mentioned in the policy address, we need to be given more time to consider a regular one-off living subsidy. But then the problem is urgent. So in the coming year, the Community Care Fund will launch 2 rounds of one-off living subsidy for the low-income households. In other words, we are covering the so-called N-nothing households. We hope that towards the end of the year 2020, we can come up with a framework for the regularized scheme. Another example is that in the past, we were very concerned about the revenue of the public coffers, or so-called the user pays principle. Today, I've referred to the question of transport and traffic instead of talking about the government revenue. When it comes to the consideration of the toll levels of government tunnels, therefore, for the Lantau Link, as well as the Chiang Mai control areas, well, come end of next year, we are going to have a second link to Chek Lap Kok. That is, we are going to have Tuen Mun Chek Lap Kok link, subsea tunnel. When it is commissioned, both the Lantau Link as well as the new tunnel will be toll-free. The same principle will apply to Chang Kwan O Tunnel. Chang Kwan O Tunnel is the only tunnel taking people from Chang Kwan O Liu Town to the urban area. So currently, the usage of which is subject to a toll. But then when we are ready with Chang Kwan O Lam Tin Tunnel, that is sometime around the end of 2021, then both tunnels can be sort of provided free of tolls, so that public transport operators as well as other motorists can consider using either of them, and both are government tunnels as well as the related control areas without having to pay a toll. Another example is as follows. That is for enterprises running on commercial principles. We used to say that they shouldn't be provided with government subsidies, but sometimes their service is urgently needed by the public. We have this example in our policy address. There are tens of thousands of people living on outlying islands. They have to rely on the ferry service for commuting. But of course, you know that for outlying island ferry service, the capital costs as well as the operating costs are always on the high side. So the outlying island residents may not be able to afford the ever-increasing fares for their ferry service.
We have considered the affordability of residents, and we will use public money to subsidize ferry services at the outlying islands. We will increase the number of ferry routes from 6 to 14, and they would be eligible for subsidy. And we will help lower the tolls of ferry services. And we can see that a number of ferries are rather old, or the fleets are rather old. For the sake of introducing greener vessels, the SAR government will spend $7 billion to purchase 47 new vessels, and we will help introduce more greener vessels, and the capital costs would not be transferred to residents of the outlying islands, and such they don't have to pay high ferry fares. Like what I said, in recent months, we have learned that we must listen more when we make our policies, and the focus should be on people's needs. For policies that benefit the people, in the past, we conducted a lot of consultation and preparatory work, especially internally. And after we came up with plans and details, they would be launched. Last year, for the whole rationalization proposal, it was one such example. The intents might be good, but since we might not have listened enough, the eventual policy could not win support from the majority of the parties. In this year's policy address, some of the measures are still worth pursuing, but then we will reinforce communication. And one example is the reclamation project of the Khao Yi Chao artificial waters under Land Out to Prohibition. In order to produce new land, we cannot give up on reclamation at Khao Yi Chao. We have enhanced public consultation exercise, and we will further communication with the residents. First of all, we would set up a platform to discuss with professionals and young people planning issues such as smart city development, smart installations and green development of Land Out to Prohibition. Another creative proposal is to satisfy the housing and employment needs of Hong Kong people. This might sound like a complex idea, but many young people today can envision housing on the artificial islands 12 years down the road. And some solutions including pre-sold units, and these would allow people to make purchases ahead of time. Despite these changes and proposals, some people might ask whether the policy address is an answer to the recent conflicts in our society. The answer is, of course, no. The policy address is just a beginning. The measures I propose under the PA would address various social issues, including land supply and housing. And I also offered a new approach, and hopefully there could be more interaction with various sectors of society. Like I stressed in the policy address, and this was something I mentioned on the 4th of September as well, I would invite opinion leaders and experts to set up an independent panel to study other deep-rooted issues and conflicts, and the preparatory work is already underway. Hopefully, this independent panel of advisors can be set up as soon as possible. I understand that peaceful and rational people are dissatisfied with the current situation, including the dissatisfaction towards myself or the government, but this is our home. This was my biggest lesson after the first dialogue session. Participants voiced their views, and I realized that they said what they said because participants love and cherish this place, and for this reason, on different issues, including those covered in policy address, we will continue to maintain dialogue with the people. On the other hand, we are concerned that a minority of the people have escalated violence, while some people might not like being condemned as being violent, but we have to ask this question: where will violence take us? Can violence solve our conflicts, or are we getting further and further from this target? I once again urge everyone to cherish our city so that peace can be restored. The 2019 District Council elections are about to get underway. We need a peaceful and calm environment so that the elections can go ahead. Thank you very much. We now proceed to the question and answer session. Please raise your hand and identify your organization before you speak. The lady in front, I'm from Sing Tao. I'd like to ask about the relationship between the legislature and executive. This morning, you failed to read your policy address at LegCo, and we can see that the relationship between the legislature and executive is set to worsen. And under the circumstances, how can the government pass the policies you have proposed, or are you merely just counting the votes? Thank you for the question. After I entered the LegCo complex this morning, I could only speak briefly. Under the Basic Law, the CE has a constitutional duty to deliver a policy address before LegCo, and under the Basic Law, LegCo must receive the delivery of the policy address from the CE, and this task was already performed. I entered the electrical complex already. Unfortunately, I could not finish delivering the policy address. In the last 2 years, I did not choose to read out the entire policy address, and I chose to introduce the policy addresses in a brief manner. So the question is, you might have, is whether the CE has fulfilled this job. From a legal and constitutional perspective, I have fulfilled this task. If opportunities allow, I would explain the contents of the policy address to LegCo and take questions. Tomorrow, I will have this opportunity. I am committed, and I sincerely hope that the Q&A session at LegCo tomorrow can go ahead as planned. As for the relationship between legislature and executive down the road, in the past 2 years, I have placed great emphasis on this relationship. Apart from the quarterly Q&A session that lasts 90 minutes at LegCo, I have introduced a short Q&A session every month of 30 minutes, and I have followed up on the views of LegCo members, and I would report the results. Given the current rifts in our society, as well as the relatively radical or partisan sentiments we saw this morning, I'm rather concerned. I wonder what kind of treatment I would receive at LegCo in the future, but personally speaking, I place an emphasis in the relationship between legislature and executive. And we have to think about the relationship between the administration and LegCo. LegCo would deal with bills presented or tabled by the administration and deal with various funding exercises. At recent Finance Committee and at recent Finance Committee meetings, there has been election of chairman and vice chairman. There is a long backlog of funding items that are waiting to be approved. All these projects are to do with all 7 million people in Hong Kong, including infrastructure and various alleviation measures. Given the economic downturn, we need the government needs to propose even more measures, and all these measures must be approved by LegCo or the Finance Committee.
As to how we can have a normal relationship between the executive and the legislature as before, I can give you an undertaking that myself and my government team will listen more to the lawmakers and will get the information that they ask for. But let me say this once again. I would like to appeal to all the lawmakers, in particular Legislative Council members of the Pan-Democratic camp. Please give first priority to the public interest of Hong Kong, and I hope that the operation will become normal again as soon as possible. TVB, you mentioned the land resumption ordinance. You said that it was a bold attempt. And then last year, you talked about the possible risk of legal action. What happened so that you had this breakthrough? You were not able to do that when you were the CS or when you were the Secretary for Development. Are you trying to let people point a blaming finger on the property developers so as to reduce the grievance? And how confident are you that this measure can be put in place, and would it be ineffective in dealing with the urgent problems? And then for the mortgage loan available, the cap on the LTV will be enhanced. But I'm afraid that this may mean that there will be more people being attracted to the property markets, and more will suffer as owners of negative equity. Let me say this. In the past, we have invoked the Land Resumption Ordinance under two sets of circumstances. First of all, after we have completed a large-scale planning for development, like Kutong North, Hong Shui Kiu, etc. Usually, it takes 3, 5, 7 years, a long period of time. And then after the planning has been done, in accordance with the zoning, we will start to resume private land. Say, for example, as stated in my speech this morning, in the coming 5 years, probably we have to resume 400 hectares of privately owned land. Another scenario is that if we have to build a hospital or to put in place transport infrastructure like railway, etc., we have and we may invoke the Land Resumption Ordinance, which has been regarded as the imperial sort. Today, we are giving topmost priority to housing. Land is for the purpose of housing. When certain sites have been left vacant and not put to housing use, then I think it is right for the government to intervene in order to prevent judicial review. When we want to resume privately owned land for the purpose of housing, we have to make sure that it is 100% public housing, like rental public housing, starter homes, as well as the green farm subsidized housing. Now, even for starter homes, it is also public housing. So we believe that we can satisfy the condition. It is no different from building roads, highways, schools, or hospitals. Even though we're quite confident in terms of legal advice, it doesn't mean that we can rule out the possibility of judicial reviews. And that's why, in my speech, I have appealed to the property developers as well as the owners of private land to consider their social responsibility and render support to our policies. One involves their land, and second is that if we can identify land suitable for housing, they can consider that matter. And then another is the land sharing scheme. Well, when it comes to the provision of land, we do have short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures. If we add up the figures, in fact, it is quite a good source of land. In fact, when you make reference to last year's grand debate on land supply, at that time we talked about a shortage of 1,200 hectares of land. The task force on land supply said that it's an underestimation. I would agree. We need to meet the existing demand. We also need to set up a land reserve or a land bank. If you add up the figures mentioned in the policy address, the quantity is not a small one. Let me take this opportunity to say the following. For each policy, for each initiative, there are challenges, say, for example, judicial review, objection in the planning process, or conflicts or confrontations in the actual land resumption. That's why, towards the end of last year, when the Task Force on Land Supply provided their final report, well, they asked the society as a whole to join hands so that we can be sure that we can implement all the short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures to provide more land for housing. As to the raising of the maximum cap for the mortgage loan to value ratio, I have noticed that a press release has been issued by the HKMC Insurance Limited because it comes into effect immediately. We are talking about the first home buyers, that is those who have got a housing need. So it will apply to 90% of the LTV, and we are talking about existing housing stock. Say, for example, for a working couple, they're able to make the monthly mortgage repayments, but they're not able to come up with the down payment. This is because, for the sake of financial stability, the LTV has been kept at a lower level. And even for the guarantee given by the Hong Kong MC Insurance Limited, market, the cap is at $4 million. Of course, the property values have weakened, but still it is quite impossible for you to get a property at a value of $4 million or below. So the difficulty to pay for the down payment has made it difficult for them to buy a property, or they have to resort to first-hand properties, as the loans can be provided by property developers. Well, some people have taken it out on me. They said that they would like to have a unit to go on the housing ladder in the secondary market. But then as a result of the LTV caps, they were not able to make it. Now we are talking about ways to help such potential home buyers. Well, there is a concern about the possible risk when the property market values go down. Now, in fact, there are other conditions to be fulfilled for the mortgage insurance program. Well, in fact, the mortgage income ratio would be 50% at most. In other words, you should be able to afford the mortgage repayment, and you need to meet the stress test of the bank. So what we want to do is to help those first-time home buyers. We would like to provide more choices to such families. But still, you need to make sure that you can afford it, whether it is the right time to buy it immediately, and you have to check whether you're able to repay the loan. So we would like to provide a suitable way to have home ownership.
Hello there. John Sudworth from the BBC. How can you hope to heal the divisions in this society if your policy address contains nothing to address the central issue driving the protests, the desire for democratic reform and the concern that Hong Kong's freedoms are being eroded under Chinese rule?
First of all, John, every year's policy address is an occasion for the chief executive to lay out for the people of Hong Kong the various initiatives and targets in the coming year, covering a wide range of subjects. I have admitted in my opening remarks that, of course, this single policy address could not address or resolve the problems in society, especially those reflected in the social unrest. You have mentioned two of these sources. One is democracy, the other is erosion. Of course, I do not agree or submit to the view that Hong Kong's rights and liberties and freedoms have been eroded in whatsoever way. Hong Kong is still a very free society. We have freedom of speech, freedom of journalism, and so on. As far as democracy, this is an extremely complicated subject, which we have to fulfill the constitutional requirements. So for a policy address to totally ignore those constitutional requirements and undertake to provide certain forms of universal suffrage for the people of Hong Kong is not a responsible act, particularly for someone like myself who 5 years ago have undertaken a full 20-month exercise aiming to give universal suffrage in the selection of a chief executive to the people of Hong Kong. But that very reasonable and constitutionally proper package has been voted down by the same group of members who are now seeking another round of discussions or a debate on the constitutional reforms. So yes, this policy address may not have all those political solutions, but I did offer, especially when the situation calms down a bit, that through dialogue, very sincere and open dialogue with various sectors in society, and also through the setting up of a committee to visit or to revisit the various underlying issues and tensions and conflicts in society to come up with a way forward on where we are going forward to. And I suppose any committee comprised of community leaders, academia, and experts in this field will have more to say on how we can take forward some of the issues that have caused anxiety in society in recent months. Thank Thank you very much.
下一條。
Next question, please.
各位女記者。
The lady on the front row, please. I'm from Shenzhen TV. Mrs. Lam, the policy address focused on land and livelihood issues. As for the Bay Area developments and the role of Hong Kong, there is not much mentioning compared with the policy address from last year. So what is the government's consideration in these issues? We see that Macau has started studying setting up an exchange or stock exchange. Are you concerned that Hong Kong might be affected? Like I said, my policy address focuses on land issues, but it doesn't mean that we ignore everything else. So when you read the policy address, please also refer to the policy address supplement, which is a new document this time, and it mentions INT development, Belt and Road, Bay Area developments, aviation, logistics, education, etc. And apart from covering what we did in the past, we also talked about what we will do in the coming year. So please be assured, for things we committed in the past or things that would benefit to our future, they would still be pursued. The Bay Area offers a lot of opportunities for Hong Kong, and I have mentioned these opportunities in my policy address. I will continue to work with my colleagues to look at opportunities brought by the Belt and Road and Bay Area and how more career opportunities can be offered to our young people. Hong Kong is a recognized global financial center. It is also the most open and international financial hub in our country, so we have every confidence in the status of Hong Kong as a financial hub. After these months, you can see that our financial system and regime are very sound. So when Macau, Shanghai, or Shenzhen develops their financial industries, they would represent opportunities for us, such that we can cooperate with these economies. The female reported at the front, my name is Ho from Ming Pao. When you presented your policy address at LegCo, you first condemned violence, and now you said you reflected on certain issues. So as for the political demands, would you resort to anything apart from the 4 points you mentioned? According to a recent popular survey, 50% of the people felt that the government has the biggest responsibility to the recent risks. 70% of the people felt the police force should be disbanded or reorganized, and 85% asked for an independent commission of inquiry. Are you going to address these? And in the past policy addresses, you talked about legislating for Article 23, but nothing has been mentioned in this policy address, including the supplement. So are you going to ignore this issue for the remainder of your term? You talked about invoking the Land Resumption Ordinance. Are you going to resume the entire Fanling Golf course? I have been addressing these issues in recent months, and I believe these problems would not deepen or ease because of a popular survey. Our priority now is to stop the violence. We can see that violence has escalated. A small number of rioters have resorted to extreme and organized means in sabotaging Hong Kong. I do not think people who love and cherish Hong Kong would resort to such lawless acts of violence. So in terms of responsibility, it should rest on these rioters who resorted to extreme violence. We hope the society can stand united in saying no to such violence. In terms of Article 23 of the Basic Law, in the past two policy addresses, some similar descriptions have been included, and that is safeguarding the national security is a constitutional duty, and there must be local legislative exercise. We have attempted this exercise twice, which led to deep conflicts. So I have always said that we must assess the situation, and we would only pursue the legislation under a suitable climate. But before we see such sentiments, the government must resort to other pieces of legislation. Nothing is more important than safeguarding national security. Hong Kong is a special administrative region. If we cannot maintain national security, the future of Hong Kong would be jeopardized. This year, you can see that the policy address and its supplement did not mention this. I'm at the middle of my term. I'm yet to host the heavy rifts and violence, and it is not likely that I would engage in another controversial exercise. So this is my stance. In terms of the Land Resumption Ordinance, our current work is based on the report submitted by the Task Force on Land Supply. In the beginning of this year, we fully accepted their report, including options such as the Fanling Golf Course. This is part of the 30 hectares mentioned. For the remaining part, long-term planning is needed, and we have to see whether they could be reprovisioned elsewhere. The residents in those areas are concerned that if there is wholesale development, there would be a heavy burden on traffic. So the land planning strategy did not deviate from the final proposal of the task force. Next question, please.
The one at the back in white.
From RTHK. The first question, you said you hope that Hong Kong can return to normal and put a stop to violence. But even the DAB just now was criticizing you for not having concrete plans on how to stop the protests. As the Ming Pao reporter told you just now, the support for the 5 demands of the protests are getting even stronger, according to the polls. So, and that nearly 3/4 of the respondents want you to step down. So, by not agreeing to the protesters' demands, do you think that you are the one stopping Hong Kong from returning to normal, or do you think turning a deaf ears to the protest is actually helping to solve the problem? My second question is on the mortgage rules. By relaxing them, but not immediately having more supply, there are people who have been quickly saying online or otherwise that property prices will definitely go up. So is this a proposal really helping people to buy a flat, or is it an attempt to assure developers that the prices would not be plunging right away? Thank you.
First of all, on the question, it is everybody's wish that Hong Kong could come out of this crisis and return to normal as soon as possible, because the damage done to Hong Kong is now already very severe, and nobody wants to see the continuation of the current situation. But to achieve that, we must not, and I emphasize, we must not give up or deviate from the very fundamental principles that get Hong Kong going. And I spent a few minutes in my policy address speech to lay out those important principles. One is, of course, to uphold one country, two systems. Secondly is to uphold the rule of law. And thirdly is to uphold Hong Kong's institutional strengths. If you will remember, of the 5 demands, the demand for amnesty is totally against the rule of law in Hong Kong. and it's actually illegal as far as the chief executive is concerned, because I have no power to interfere with the prosecution as well as the judicial proceedings in the courts. So to demand the chief executive to do something that is illegal, unlawful, and deviates from the important principle of rule of law is something that I'm afraid that I could not concede to. The second thing is, of course, when one of the demands was universal suffrage. I have answered John's question that this is governed by constitutional principles, that is under one country, two systems, and provisions in the basic law. So again, we could not deviate or breach this important constitutional principle by accepting this particular demand. So. It's illegal as far as the chief executive is concerned, because under the basic law, the chief executive or the only person or the only department who could make a decision on prosecution is the Department of Justice. So you are putting me as a sort of a subject to agree to those demands, and that's what I am sharing with you. And I have to say that actually many people will not condone the granting of amnesty by the Hong Kong SAR government, whether it's by the Department of Justice or another authority that has that jurisdiction to do that. But of course, as I said, under the basic law, the only authority rests with the Department of Justice. As far as the question on the mortgage insurance, I have quoted in answering to another question the press release issued just by the Hong Kong Mortgage Corporation Insurance Limited. The initiative attempts to help those first-time home buyers who have enough income to support a property to repay the mortgage loan, but they don't have enough money to pay for the first lump sum, because the mortgage amount is relatively low provided by the banks. And as far as the mortgage insurance is concerned, which provides 90%, the value of the property is capped at $4 million. So we have heard a lot of grievances from professionals who are caught in that sort of situation. As a result, they have no alternative to buy a flat except turning to the first-hand market, where the developer provides a second mortgage. So the objective of this relaxation is to enable this group of people who need to buy for their self-use. So it has to be a first-time home buyer. It is for their own use. Then they have this choice to get a higher level of, through the insurance, to get a high level of loan so that they could buy for their own use. So I don't feel that this is sort of pressurizing people to buy in a dropping market, and hence they will be caught in a difficult financial situation. At the end of the day, buying a flat, buying a property in Hong Kong is a pretty important decision. So I'm sure everyone will assess their own financial situation and come to a view. The government's role is really to provide choices, to provide facilitation, so that they will have a better opportunity to exercise their decision to get themselves a home in a particular sort of situation.
下一條，第一排最遠
The next
西
question.
裝嗰位人。
The gentleman in suit at the far end, front row. Thank you. I'm from Now TV. Well, when you started your remarks, you said that billions of dollars will be spent on buying green ferries for outlying islands, ferry service. My understanding is that after you have bought the vessels, the ferries will own, the ferry companies will own the ferries. Is it something very odd? It seems that you're benefiting the ferry service operators. Well, you are already subsidizing their operation, and yet you are buying the ferries for them. And then for education, you are still giving $2,500 to the students, secondary school, primary school, and kindergarten students, but not the university undergraduates. Will it add to their grievance and dissatisfaction, thinking that they are not having a stake in the society? And I want to know whether you're going to disqualify the candidates who have shouted slogans, "Liberate Hong Kong." And then the U.S. has already approved the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. So are you worried that for the officers involved in the disqualification of candidates, they will be barred from going to the U.S. as a result of that act? First of all, about subsidizing the ferry service. Well, first of all, I know that the operating cost as well as the capital cost for ferry service is high. So we are providing a subsidy to the ferry companies in relation to operating costs so as to ease the pressure on a fare increase. And we hope that in 10 years' time we can help them to replace the existing fleet so that they don't have to spend their own money. Well, I've looked at their accounts. I don't think any operator will be interested in replacing their fleet. They are very expensive. We have to spend $7 billion to acquire 47 ferries. So you can see that they're expensive. They're not quite viable. But then the ferries are getting older and older, and they're belching black smoke. So maybe a way out is for the government to spend money on the purchase of the ferries. Well, of course, we haven't come down to the minute details about the contractual terms. Well, as to whether we can buy the ferries and give the ferries to the operators, and then they use the ferries for something else, like getting a loan, I don't think it will work that way. The idea is that we hope we can help them to dispense with the capital expenditure so that they don't have to increase their fares so often and so much. So in future, maybe it's a matter of operation and management. We are putting up a lot of capital costs, so it may be a matter of operation and management contract, and then the fares will be subject to our regulatory framework. And as to your second question, as stated in my policy address speech, we understand that for many parents, when the school year starts, they have to spend a lot of money, irrespective of the fact that we do have a textbook assistance scheme. It is still very costly. Therefore, the Financial Secretary has regularized the subsidy which has been launched in the past, so that secondary, primary school students as well as kindergarten pupils will get $2,500 every year at the beginning of a school year. And then for tertiary students, there is another financial scheme to help them. They can get a loan or they can get a grant. So that's what we call the grant and loan for the tertiary students, and that's why they have not been covered under this scheme.
In terms of support to young people, in the supplement of the CE, there is some mentioning, including internships, exchange programs, etc. Some people are wondering whether I don't care about education, because apparently there is not a lot of funding. Education expenditure has increased substantially in recent years. It went from $5 billion to $8 billion, and the resources have been reinforced substantially. So everyone who satisfies the DSE requirement can benefit if they enroll in self-financing institutions. I talked about the district council elections because there is much concern whether the election scheduled for the 24th of November can go ahead as usual. I stress that the SAR government is extremely determined. We would do our best to ensure that the district council elections can go ahead as usual. But it can only take place if there is more peace and calm, and without so many candidates being subject to nuisance. As for the eligibility of specific candidates, the returning officers would look at the relevant legal provisions and actual circumstances. They might inquire the relevant individuals and look at their statements or declarations. As for possible pressure faced by the returning officers, nowadays there's a lot of doxing and cyberbullying. So at the by-election last time, some returning officers were subject to this kind of nuisance. Of course, I hope that there will not be repeats. And in terms of foreign sanctions on Hong Kong officials, they are totally groundless. And the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and this is highly regrettable. It was a blatant interference by a foreign parliament. We don't need foreign parliaments to tell us how important human rights and democracy are to Hong Kong, because these are our core values and they would be defended by every Hong Kong citizen. The lady at the back, please.
Hello, Mrs. Lam, HKIBC. In months leading up to your policy address, you have only spoken to members of the public once during the dialogue session. And after leaving LegCo this morning, the Pandams accused you of working like a government in exile. So what are your views on that, on both the comments by Pandams and the communication opportunities with the public? And can we assume this will be the new norm, that you will simply shun the opposition camp and the public in your future policy making? Thank you.
Well, not at all. As I have mentioned on the 4th of September, where I mentioned about the 4 actions, we are very committed to engaging different sectors in society. But the dialogue that we are establishing takes various forms. So one form is the sort of open, district-based dialogue, televised, and so on. The other will be more in-depth, intense dialogue, closed door, with a smaller number of participants. And for that particular type of dialogue, I had attended at least 4 times. Each time lasted for 2 to 3 hours. So dialogue takes many forms. The third is, if I may announce here, tomorrow I will have a Facebook Live to communicate directly with netizens who want to ask me questions on the policy address or other issues. Looking ahead, I myself and my principal officials will double our efforts in engaging with members of the public through various types of dialogue. Because you have to understand, we are now living in a rather distressful situation, and many of those people who want to talk to us, they don't want to be seen to be talking to us, because that may arouse some resistance from some of their peers, or it may attract some of those black-clad protesters to the venue. So if some of these communication sessions were behind closed door, I hope you understand it is often not our unilateral wish. It is to respect the participants in those dialogues. But certainly, communicating more with the people will be an important feature of my governance in the remaining of my term, because I've just emphasized how I have reflected on the way I did my public service over the last 3 to 4 decades, and how I felt it is so very important to listen more attentively to the people and then construct our own policies accordingly.
Next question, please. The reporter in white at the back. Mrs. Lam, I'm from ODN. My name is Leung. In terms of the mortgage or maximum loan ratio, you said that this is intended for first-time home buyers. So what is the anticipated impacts on property prices? Some owners who have been offering their flats on the market stop doing so immediately. How confident are you in meeting the demand, because we are talking about a very substantial sum? By what extent would the recurrent expenditure increase from the policy address, and together with the measures announced by Mr. Paul Chan, would Hong Kong's deficit worsen? As for the structural fiscal deficit, what would be the impacts? Are you recklessly giving out money in order to increase popularity? And there is much concern on whether you would respond to demands like setting up an independent commission of inquiry. And if you don't face these demands, how would the public see this policy address in terms of rental allowance? In the past, the government did not want to interfere with the private market, so now are you interfering with the private market? Is this conflicting? Thank you for your questions. First of all, like I explained, the relaxation of the maximum loan-to-value ratio and the cap on the value of a property would be relaxed to $8 million. This is to benefit first-time home buyers who purchase for their own use, and this is to provide an extra option for them. In the past, they might not be able to afford the down payment, and as such, they had to resort to secondary mortgage for new properties. Hong Kong's property market is rather sensitive, and as such, the market reacted immediately today, which is inevitable. But prospective buyers can take their time. I'm sure they would assess the situation carefully. Given the recent conflicts and the worsening economy, there is expectation of a downward trend in the property market, and the cumulative drop in the past few months have been 5%, as far as I know. As to whether now is an opportune time to buy, it is up to the prospective buyers. As for overall public housing supply, we have a 10-year housing development program, and the mix has been switched to 70% in public housing. In terms of land, we still lack land for about 60,000 units. So long as we have the funding and capability to develop housing, it would be done. And on the short term, you talked about a substantial figure. I wonder if you are referring to the forecast for next year. The number of saleable flats for next year would be 12,000 GFS and HOS units, and 7,300 HOS units, and 4,700 GSH units. The 2019 batch is yet to be sold, and we have more than 3,000 units there. So these are some concrete figures. As for future supply, it depends on the pace of land development. So I urge the entire community to chip in such efforts.
You have also got a few questions about the financial implications of the initiatives in this policy address. As you have said, we are going to experience an economic downturn. In this case, it means that we are going to see a reduction in government revenue. At the same time, the public would have more expectation about what the government can do and will do. So we have to reserve our capability and the financial resources to meet the uncertainties in the future. So in this policy address, we don't have any cash handouts. For each and every initiative, it is within our means and it is for the sake of meeting the needs of the public. Of course, Hong Kong is fortunate. For many years, we didn't have a fiscal deficit. The last one was in the year when we were affected by SARS in 2003-2004. And we have accumulated a huge fiscal reserve up to $11 billion. In fact, we have got $600 billion by way of our recurrent expenditure, or rather the non-recurrent expenditure, and then $400 billion for the recurrent expenditure. Should we see major fluctuations, in particular when the economy goes down, and if we can't cut the recurrent expenditure, then we're going to see a larger deficit. We saw that when we experienced the financial tsunami. Well, you don't need to worry. What we're going to propose is not going to create too many problems about our fiscal structure. For the FS relief measures, as usual, they are not recurrent in nature. They are usually one-off. We have a package of $19.1 billion, so as not to bring about a structural problem to our fiscal management. Now, for this policy address, whenever we come up with initiatives with an implication on recurring expenditure, that's about meeting the urgent needs of the community. And irrespective of our fiscal position, we still have to provide services to the young children for their child care and for the elderly, etc. Of course, I hope the community will take an overall view of all our initiatives in the policy address. We deal with all the 7 million people in Hong Kong. Some are more concerned about economic issues, others about livelihood issues. The majority of the people are concerned about the unrest, the riotous activities in Hong Kong. They would like to see Hong Kong becoming normal again. It is hoped that calm can be restored, and then the Hong Kong government can restore the public confidence, and the business environment will improve and will continue to attract overseas investors for our economic development. As to my view on rent allowance, in the past, we used to think along the government's line or thinking. That is, usually we would say that a rental subsidy or rent allowance would bring about an increase in the rental level, benefiting the landlords instead of the tenants. And then with rent control, landlords may not be interested in leasing their properties, and it would only reduce the total supply. Many officials have stated this stance, including myself. Now we think that if there's a housing need, and as we have said, it is not a simple It is not simply a commodity. Now, people who live in Hong Kong, they have expectations of the Hong Kong government. They hope that they can get a roof over their heads. So we help the people by producing public housing all the time, but then we are lagging far behind in terms of supply. And on average, people have to wait for 5.4 years to get a unit. Now, for a long time, they have to live in very poor living conditions. So as to the rationale that I've just put forward would not mean anything to them. Now, they are not able to get housed in a rental unit, but still they hope that their daily expenditure on housing hopefully could be reduced. So we try to think along this line. Now, if the family is self-reliant, they would like to get some help in terms of accommodation. Perhaps they will start to think that it's better for them to rely on CSSA because under that scheme they have a rent allowance. Would it be good for us to have this scenario? We hope to help households who want to stay self-reliant. So probably we should set aside our bureaucratic thinking and try our best to help them. Of course, we are not able to come up with a better solution. Some have suggested that you need to be on the waiting list for 3 years before you're entitled to the assistance. Well, there are others who have never been on the waiting list, or someone on the waiting list for that 1 year may have a poorer living condition than those having been on the waiting list for a longer time. So give us some time so that we can consider a regular program in the form of a living subsidy to help them. I think at the end of the day, both the families as well as the government would like to see more public housing for rental purposes for this group of households. The next question. The one in white. I'm from Xinhua News. Well, for the past few months, the financial markets as well as the financial institutions are plagued with a lot of rumors. The Hong Kong MA and the Hong Kong Exchange clarified in relation to the rumors. It is said that we should have a greater control over such rumors. And then in April 2018, there was a reform about the listing rules. And in 2018, we topped the world league table in terms of IPO. But then it seems that it has put a stop to the IPO activities. What are you going to do to enhance the investors' confidence in Hong Kong? How can you make sure that people would not waver in terms of the confidence in Hong Kong? Well, of course, we have also been bothered by the rumors. It's not just confined to the financial sector. Some about the work of the police, some about the work of the SARG. Online, there are many untrue rumors, and therefore the ISD, the police, the hospital authority have to clarify the rumors instantly. But then, of course, you know that in Hong Kong, we do uphold and treasure the freedom of speech. As to the status of Hong Kong as a financial center, it is important. In fact, we are most international, most open in terms of an IFC throughout China. There are regulatory issues. There are also development issues. For the current term government, yes, of course, we would like to enhance our regulatory work. We would also like to see more development. You mentioned that in April last year, the Hong Kong Exchange proposed the most important reform to the listing rules. Of course, recently it has been affected. First of all, we have the relationship between the U.S. and China as well as the trade disputes. And then you know what happened in the past 4 years. If I say that the investors' confidence hasn't been affected, it is not true. In fact, it does affect the investors' confidence. For the IPO exercises, probably those potential proponents are reconsidering their plans. Yes, the number involved has been lowered, but I recall that as far as the total value is concerned, we still rank third in the world. And then as to the new listing rules, well, I think we have got about 10 enterprises that would like to have the dual class of shares. And also for enterprises that haven't made a profit yet, they are also interested. What we have to do is to stop the violence, restore calm. I think the government, as well as the related organizations, including the Hong Kong Exchange, will all try our best to promote the image of Hong Kong, both locally as well as overseas. We'll try our best to attract the investors to come to Hong Kong again.
粉紅色衫。
The lady in pink, please.
Mrs. Lam, I'm from Reuters. You say you are determined to break through the old mindset to resume more land for public housing, but some critics are skeptical. They say there is a lot of agricultural land still being held by developers that the government is unaware of, held in complex webs of shell companies to conceal their ownership. These critics say you could resume a lot more land than you have announced so far, and that the government is still likely to collude with the developers. What's your response to this? Second question, it is noted that in the last community dialogue, you mentioned autonomy is not one country, two system, and you didn't mention high degree of autonomy in the long paragraph regarding the one country, two system in this policy address. Is a high degree of autonomy, as promised by the Basic Law, remains one of the governance principles of the Hong Kong government? What's your response to this? Thank you.
Okay. If I may, just respond to your second question first. When I said in my policy address that one of the most important principles that we should uphold, whether in dealing with this crisis or in future governance, is one country, two systems. Of course, it also embraces high degree of autonomy and Hong Kong people administering Hong Kong. I realized the sensitivity towards omission of certain phrases, and that's why in responding to one of the questions just now, I repeated that it is one country, two systems, high degree of autonomy, and Hong Kong people administering Hong Kong. So there should be no worry or suspicion about the importance of this high degree of autonomy. But it doesn't mean that it is absolute to the extent that Hong Kong people could decide on Hong Kong's future and things like that. Okay. About the first question, if you look at the figures, especially figures that have been rehearsed in the Land Supply Task Force last year, when they mentioned about brownfield sites, actually they were talking only about maybe 100 to 220 hectares. 110 to 220 hectares of brownfield sites, which the task force said that we should find ways to develop, maybe resume or otherwise, in the next 10 to 30 years. So compared to what I just mentioned, following a survey and a study on the brownfield sites, we have identified 450 hectares of privately owned, mostly privately owned brownfield sites that have potential. And the first stage of a further study to see whether they are suitable for public housing comprises 160 hectares. So that is a good size of the brownfield sites to be resumed by the government for public housing. Of course, we could go further if we have the means to complete the necessary planning. Someone has asked me that previously we were very concerned about judicial challenges by going into private land to resume. So one of the safeguards or prerequisites that we have to achieve before using this land resumption ordinance is to have planning. So we cannot just be very interested in a piece of agricultural land that we feel it may be good for our use in future, and then we go into resume. That will not meet the requirement under the law for a public purpose. So we have to demonstrate that following a process, and I hope it's an expedited process of town planning, that we have confirmed the use of that piece of land for public housing, plus other ancillary facilities like schools and community centers and so on. So the approach now, it's more important to look at the approach, of course, as well as the identified scale that I have mentioned in my policy address. There should be no worry about collusion, because this is government exercising the power to resume. Some people may have some worry about the land sharing scheme. The land sharing scheme is more sort of public-private participation. So the government will cooperate with the private sector to develop the privately owned land, but the government needs to share no less than 70% of the extra gross floor area created by that private land through some form of government facilitation. For example, put in widened roads or infrastructure so that the plot ratio could be significantly increased from a very low level to a higher level. In order to overcome any concerns of that sort, I have suggested, in fact, the Development Bureau will come up with more details later on, that we will have a mechanism. We will invite a group of people to form an advisory panel to look at each and every of a case. And then even if this panel agrees, the case will go to Chief Executive Council and then go through the town planning process, which is a very transparent process. So everybody could look at that particular case and the government's deliberations on that case. Secondly is we have also put in a time limit. So this land sharing scheme is available for only 3 years. Okay. And secondly, we put in a cap. We are only willing to do, as a pilot, 150 hectares. So that would perhaps speed up the whole process, and whoever is ready to come forward, present a plan so we can have more housing being built from this particular strategy of land sharing scheme. Thank you very much.
Next question, the lady on the second row in short hair, please. Mrs. Lam, good afternoon. I'm from AM 730. In paragraph 4 of the policy address, you talked about 4 main principles, including one country, 2 systems, and you would not tolerate any acts that advocate Hong Kong's independence. This is similar to the last policy address. Does it mean that the government does not feel a need to reinforce their efforts in these regards? And we often talked about the phrase "liberate Hong Kong revolution of our times" in recent times. So has this slogan breached the red line? Is this a threat to national security? And for the song "Glory to Hong Kong," would it be prohibited, for example, in schools? In my policy address, I named 3 major principles. These are the cornerstones of Hong Kong. Of course, they won't be moved easily. As you can see, if there are substantial changes to principles year on year, then you should be concerned. These are our core values that are ever present: one country, 2 systems, rule of law, and our constitutional edge. So I would like to reiterate these principles, especially under the current rifts. Some people might feel lost, and it is even more important to adhere to such principles. As for my view on certain claims, well, if we are not at an election period, I might be willing to share more thoughts with you. But since we are at an elections period, these have to do with our returning officers dealing with the eligibility of different people. The chief executive should not offer her comments, but you can be assured that our returning officers would look at the relevant laws and evidence and the explanations from candidates before making their decisions. Next question, please. Good afternoon. I'm from the Economic Times. I have 2 questions. First on rental allowance. And like you said, the rent allowance might give the impression that owners would benefit. I realize that the government wants to help the people, but as you know, the market is volatile. It's easily affected by sentiments. So without a proposal, you are already making an announcement. So would you be concerned that rents would be driven up already? And like other reporters asked, there is a popular opinion survey, and the survey mentioned the anti-mask law. 60% of the people are against it, 20% found it useless, and together these represent 80% of the people. The anti-mask law is not targeted at violent protesters. Have you considered that some other residents might be fearful of retribution? Have you considered their views? And we call it a living allowance or living subsidy. It might not be directly related to rent allowance, but our targets are clear. They are low-income families not receiving CSSA and not living in PRH. So for the annual program in the coming year, and we are targeting the same sector, those not living in PRH and those not receiving CSSA. We would offer a living allowance. In the past, we could not overcome such concerns, so we decided not to pursue it. But what I said was we understand there are concerns and we would do our best to overcome them. I don't know whether rent control would be effective, but we could not just procrastinate just because there are certain concerns.
Well, for such families, they would say that they are not yet able to get to the turn to be rehoused, and they look to the government for some help. So we try to be cautious. First of all, we have 2 rounds of living subsidy for such households that are having a low level of income. We just want to show to the public that housing is important, and we are willing to go all out to help them. As to the prohibition of face covering regulation, I think you recall what I said that time. It's a very difficult decision. As you have rightly put it, it may not be effective instantly. We'd like to have some deterrent effect, and we hope that we can facilitate the enforcement work of the police, relatively speaking. But of course, people are wearing face masks, and there are many of them. You can't enforce the law immediately, and there are others who have an actual need to cover their face. So on the face of it, it may be a very brief piece of regulation with just a few provisions, but still we have to address the problem. Now, you can't have the face covered at such meetings, and unless you are a reporter like you. Now, if you say that you want to join others at the public meeting, and yet you don't want to be identified, and so you want to be masked, I'm sorry, it is an open and inclusive society. If we are talking about peaceful public assembly, then I don't think you need to get worried that your face will be seen and exposed. In fact, for the past 10-20 years, we have had many protests and demonstrations participated by a large number of people. Never had they needed to mask their face before they could take part, quite unlike recently. Now we are talking about a regulation which has been introduced on an emergency basis, and that's why we have invoked the Emergency Regulations Ordinance. I really hope that when calm is restored, we no longer need to have this provision. And then at that time, you don't need to worry so much. The next question, the one in the front in black. Mrs. Lam. Good afternoon. I'm from Apple Daily. As you have said, the policy address may not be the answer to all the social briefs. It may be but the beginning. But the findings of a poll have been cited by my colleagues. You are not going to meet the demands of the people. Don't you know what has gone wrong, or are you trying to go down together with all of us? That is the scorched earth policy. Well, recently we have got lawless damage. Probably for that kind of people, your descriptor suits them better. Now, for this policy address, the title is Treasure Hong Kong, Our Home. Every day when you read the papers, when you see the large-scale public activities, you see rioters damaging Hong Kong. They just to trash Hong Kong. I can almost say that they are not really fighting for a particular cause. They don't have anything specific to fight for. I think maybe they only want to see one result. That is, they would like to ruin Hong Kong, and that's why they go about trashing Hong Kong. I don't share the same mentality. I still want to work for the good of Hong Kong. And therefore, with the utmost resolution, I'll continue to serve Hong Kong. I will work through this policy address. In addition, in terms of governance, we are having a style of listening will be more interactive. And we shouldn't and we won't be imposing our own views prematurely on the society. We hope that we can get Hong Kong out of this difficult situation. I was born here and I was brought up here, and this is my undertaking. The future days would not be easy. Well, just see what happened this morning. For the past 2 years, I used to go to the Legco to have an interaction with the legislators, and yet it descended into something very bad, and I'm afraid there will still be more similar scenarios in the future. But I will continue because I love Hong Kong, and I hope that together with you we can build Hong Kong our home. Thank you. The last two questions. The one in the front row. Good afternoon. I'm from Guangzhou Daily. If I may pick up the earlier question. Well, lawmakers wrote to the chief executive talking about the inciting remarks spread on the internet, provoking the young people to take to the street and be engaged in unlawful activities. A police officer had his neck slashed, and then we found that there was an anatomy of a human neck being placed online with clear instructions in Chinese, saying that in future, if you would like to have a fatal attack, where you should strike and how you should strike. I think to us, this is really important, yes, serious and radical. So they have written to you about this matter. So I want to know what you're going to do about it. Another question is that's about the Greater Bay Area. For that development outline plan, it is said that we should go at full steam to develop the GBA in terms of the ecological and environmental development. What is your view and what is your plan? As to your first question, in recent months, we have found such remarks online. They are verging on incitement and then doxing and malicious attacks, leakage of personal data, etc. I have been most saddened by it. But then in Hong Kong, we observe the rule of law, so we have to resort to legal means to deal with it, including the Office of the Commissioner of Personal Data Privacy.
The police would crack down on online crimes. In recent years, they have reinforced their efforts. For online claims that incite criminal offences, the police would take action. As for possible inadequacies in the current laws, in view of the recent incidents, the SAR government would review and amend the laws as accordingly. Like we mentioned in the supplement, we mentioned that some certain aspects of the protection of personal data ordinance must be improved. As for the Bay Area developments, you talked about ecological and conservation efforts. We would just say that we place a great emphasis on ecological and cultural developments because the Bay Area can become an example for the nation, for Guangdong, Macau, and Hong Kong. They all did a lot in these efforts, in these aspects, and with the I recently talked to the Guangdong mayor, and we submitted a proposal to the Guangdong municipal government, and we hope that through a working group we can realize the relevant plans. In my policy address, I mentioned green ferries. We will spend $7 billion to procure green ferries. So this is a measure related to the ecology, and other green measures will also be included in our preliminary plan for Bay Area development. We will take 2 more questions since we have English and online media.
Thank you for taking questions from a Hong Kong English newspaper. I'm Tony from South China Morning Post, and I have 3 questions for you. Number one, your only message in the protest seems to be to stop the violence, and then you move on to housing and underprivileged and business people. But in past few months, a lot of young people have been protesting on the streets, and but your policy address doesn't have a chapter on young people at all. So what's your message for young people? What about their parents, and what about the people who lost their jobs because a lot of restaurants and businesses closed down? Number 2, with you leaving the Leshko this morning when lawmakers are chanting people's demands, does it really show that you've lost the ability or even the political legitimacy to continue to govern Hong Kong? And number 3, I have a follow-up on the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. Because this morning, the Beijing government strongly condemned the passage of the act, but your government only expressed regrets. So is this kind of like a gap in disappointment, or does it show that the government that you're leading is really a lame duck government in retreat mode? Thank you.
Well, first of all, as I've said, this year's policy address, as far as the tax is concerned, is a more focused version. So if you look at the so-called chapters, apart from the foreword and a conclusion, there are only 4 chapters covering housing, land supply, livelihood issues, and economic development. I don't have a chapter on elderly. I don't have a chapter on medical services as in previous years. The reason being we have produced at the same time a policy address supplement. And if you go to the supplement, it does have a full coverage of all the policy areas, including a dedicated chapter on young people. I think it's towards the end. And so I continue to attach a lot of importance to young people. So we will not only continue these initiatives to support our young people in terms of education, in terms of employment, entrepreneurship, we will continue to find more projects to build youth hostels to meet their temporary housing needs. We will also provide more opportunities for their participation in policy making, or even for joining the government to understand how government operates. So all these work will continue. And on top of that, some of the measures to support young people could be found in the chapters on education. Because university undergraduates and also graduates, they are covered under the education chapter. As far as helping people who may be out of a job or unemployed or underemployed in the economic downturn, the Financial Secretary has already rolled out 2 packages in August and September. The first package has a price tag of $19.1 billion to help a range of people and also provide various initiatives. The second package concentrated on SMEs. I can tell you that the Financial Secretary is drawing up a 3rd package, hopefully to be released later this month, because the situation keeps on evolving. So whenever the government notices that there are certain things that we should do because of the economic downturn, I can promise you that we will do it. We are not waiting. So the Financial Secretary has not waited for my policy address. And he is not waiting for his budget speech next February. So we will continue to do those measures. The second question is about political legitimacy and my ability to govern. Of course, I understand that as a result of these 4 months social unrest, many people are very unhappy with the situation and even with the government, because we could not promise them when things will go back to normal. And for some of those, we could not promise them the things that they want us to do. But that doesn't mean that we have no will to continue to govern. The will and the determination to govern is still there. That's why, despite the pressure and the time constraint in the last few months, my colleagues have put together a very substantive policy address and a policy address supplement with over 220 initiatives. And we will put our mind together to implement all these initiatives. I will continue to accord importance to relationship with Legislative Council members across the political spectrum. But this is not something that I could do unilaterally. For example, I understand that the Chief Secretary for Administration has tried to engage the non-pro-establishment members to sit down to talk about the prioritization of the funding proposals so that we could do what we do, what I used to do last year, that is, let's deal with the easier items, 先易後難. Let's deal with the easier items in the Finance Committee and put back the difficult items. But apparently they did not want to talk. So this is not something that I could control, but we will continue to attach importance to. Now, of course, Hong Kong, under one country, two systems, we have our own system. We have our own way of commenting and responding to issues. So I would suggest that there's no need for you to draw a comparison between how we say something and how the central government said something, because we are different. And so we will, but the same frustration and disappointment and regret exists in either the Hong Kong SAR government or the Central People's Government, because this Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is totally unjustified and unwarranted. It will hurt not only the Hong Kong business, it will hurt American interests in Hong Kong. They have 1,400 companies, 85,000 citizens in Hong Kong who have taken Hong Kong as a home. They work here, they invest here. So to have that sort of act creating a lot of uncertainties will also damage the business confidence and, in turn, the businesses' prospects in Hong Kong.
最後呢位網媒嘅朋友。
Final question from an online media. I'm from Stan News. My name is Chen. I have two questions. First of all, Mrs. Lam, in the past two policy addresses, there's a dedicated chapter on the youth, and now this time the chapter is to be found in the supplement. And in your policy address, you mentioned youth 3 times. One was about the youth hostel and twice about the land out to Prohibition. A lot of young people have things to say about the government and police brutality, as well as the 5 demands. So are you once again telling these people that they have no stake in the society and that you would ignore their demands? This is my first question. Secondly, you stressed that in the anti-extradition law saga in recent months, a small number of rioters wanted to sabotage Hong Kong. And like you said in the policy address, 2,000 people have been arrested, and many of them are aged 15 or 16. They are yet to undergo their DSE exams. Yesterday, a 13 or 14-year-old was charged for assaulting a police officer. As a mother, Mrs. Lam, how can you convince watching parents that their teenage children are the so-called rioters who wanted to sabotage Hong Kong, as you claimed? And as a result of what you said, generations of Hong Kong people you have antagonized generations of Hong Kong people as well as their parents. Like I said, this year's policy address focuses on land supply and housing, and there is much, and the many issues are instead discussed at the supplement, and this would supplement the policy address in explaining our policies and our work. There's still a dedicated chapter on youth.
It's been put at the very last chapter. It doesn't mean that it's not important. Rather, it means that it's most important. For the preceding chapters, education, housing, etc., have also got a component about the youth. So I hope that young people who read about economic development of innovation technology, then they will know that we try to give them a better prospect. And then towards the end, we hope that the young would know that would like to help them in setting up their enterprises and will help them to take part in public affairs, etc. So what you said is certainly not our stance towards the young. We are still very keen about our young people. We still believe that they are our future, they are our next generation. And that's why we would like to give them a good environment to grow up and develop. And then, as to the second point, I've never said that for the young teenagers who have been arrested are all rioters. Well, it is a large-scale activity. It is difficult just to arrest the most violent rioters. Law is the law. The law would also cover people who take part in unlawful assemblies, people who have assaulted the police, people who are in possession of articles that they should not be having them in their possession. I've not said that such young people are rioters, but then they're not yet mature, and for them to take part in such radical activities, it is a cause of concern for us. So we thought hard, and then we came to the decision. That is, we introduced the prohibition on face covering regulation, so that we can help parents, headmasters, and teachers, so that they can advise the young people not to mask their face, thinking that their identities have been hidden, and so they can go out to join illegal activities, jeopardizing their future. So I would like to appeal to the parents. So please explain to your children, advise them that Hong Kong is facing a very complex issue. Maybe young people, teenagers, may not be in grasp of every detail. So they need to be cautious, they need to be careful, and they have to think twice before they determine to take part in such radical activities. Thank you. That's the end of today's press conference.